You stand in the center of a Roman villa, sunlight filtering through marble columns as the master of the house raises his hand. A slave flinches, bracing for the blow that Roman law permits, even encourages. But then the master hesitates. His hand trembles. Not from mercy, but from fear. Because there is one thing he cannot do, one boundary even absolute power cannot cross, and the consequences of violating it could destroy everything he has built. The slave knows this. The master knows this. And in that frozen moment you witness the invisible line that separated brutality from annihilation in ancient Rome. Before we uncover what that forbidden act was, I'd be fascinated to know where you're watching from. It's extraordinary how a legal boundary from 2,000 years ago still echoes across continents, connecting us through our shared curiosity about the limits of power and the resilience of the human spirit. The year is 61 CE. The place, the sprawling estates and crowded insulae of Rome, where nearly 1 in 3 people are enslaved. The air carries the scent of olive oil and unwashed bodies, the sounds of hammers against bronze, merchants hauling garum, and beneath it all the quiet shuffle of bare feet on stone, the footsteps of millions who own nothing, not even themselves. Roman slavery is not the race-based institution that would later scar the Americas. It is indiscriminate, devouring prisoners of war, debtors, the children of slaves, conquered peoples from Britannia to Syria. A person could be free one day, enslaved the next, their entire existence reduced to property, a res, a thing. The legal framework governing this system is brutally comprehensive. Slaves can be bought, sold, gifted, inherited. They can be beaten, branded, chained. They work in mines where life expectancy is measured in months, in brothels where their bodies are commodities, in fields under the merciless sun, in the households of the wealthy where they are invisible hands maintaining an illusion of effortless luxury. Roman law grants their owners powers that approach the absolute. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, wields life and death authority over his entire familia, including slaves. He can order floggings for the smallest infractions. He can sell a slave's children, separate families without a second thought. He can compel sexual submission and the law will not intervene. The slave has no legal personhood, no right to testimony in court, no protection from cruelty. Yet within this architecture of domination, there exists a paradox. A restriction so fundamental that violating it threatens not just the master's property, but his very citizenship, his honor, his place in Roman society. To understand this boundary, you must first understand what Romans feared more than rebellion, more than economic loss. They feared pollution, contamination, the invisible stain that could spread from one impure act and corrupt everything it touched. In the household of Lucius Pedanius Secundus, a wealthy Roman senator, this tension between power and prohibition plays out with devastating clarity. Pedanius owns 400 slaves. They maintain his gardens, prepare his meals, carry his litter through Roman streets, manage his correspondence, tutor his children. His authority over them seems limitless. When a slave breaks a valuable amphora, Pedanius orders him whipped. When another attempts to flee, he has the man branded with the letter F for fugitivus, a permanent mark of shame and warning. When he desires a young slave woman, he takes her to his bed, and Roman society barely notices. These are not crimes. They are the prerogatives of ownership. But there is one thing Pedanius cannot do, one act forbidden not by mercy but by something deeper, more primal in the Roman psyche. He cannot kill a slave with premeditation and call it justified. Not because Roman law suddenly values the slave's life, but because such a killing, unless conducted according to strict ritual protocols, unleashes forces that threaten the very fabric of Rome's relationship with the divine. Romans believe the gods watch. They believe in the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods that sustains Rome's prosperity and power. Blood spilled unjustly, even the blood of a slave, offends the divine order. It creates a spiritual pollution, a miasma that clings to the killer, spreads to his household, seeps into the community. This pollution, called nephas, makes the gods turn their faces away. Crops fail, children sicken, military campaigns falter. the entire city suffers for one man's transgression. So while a master can beat a slave to death in a fit of rage and claim it was discipline gone too far, he cannot calmly decide, without cause that Roman law recognizes, to execute a slave and expect no consequences. If he does, he must perform specific rituals, make offerings, undergo purification. And even then his reputation suffers. His peers whisper, "Is he a man who cannot control his household without resorting to murder? Is he so weak that mere slaves drive him to kill?" In a society obsessed with honor and public image, this judgment can be as devastating as any legal penalty. This boundary reveals itself most starkly when a slave named Narcissus commits the unthinkable. He murders Pedanius. The details are murky in the historical record, preserved in fragments by the historian Tacitus. Some say Narcissus was driven by rage after Pedanius reneged on a promise of freedom. Others whisper of sexual jealousy, of a young male slave Pedanius desired whom Narcissus loved. Whatever the motive, the act itself shatters the social order. A slave has killed his master. Roman law is unambiguous in its response. The Senatus Consultum Sielanianum, a decree passed decades earlier, mandates that when a master is murdered, all slaves under his roof must be executed. Not just the killer, but every single person who might have prevented the crime or failed to raise an alarm. 400 human beings, most of whom had nothing to do with Narcissus's act, are condemned to death. The city erupts in controversy. Crowds gather outside the Senate pleading for mercy, not because they suddenly recognize the humanity of slaves, but because the sheer scale of the killing seems excessive even by Roman standards. 400 crucifixions lining the Appian Way. 400 bodies left to rot as warnings. The economic loss alone is staggering. Property worth hundreds of thousands of sestertii destroyed in a single afternoon. But the senators, led by Gaius Cassius Longinus, a jurist of cold precision, argue that the law must stand. To spare even one slave would be to invite chaos. If slaves believe they might escape punishment by claiming ignorance, every master in Rome becomes vulnerable. The household must be understood as a collective unit of guilt. Narcissus's crime is their crime. His pollution is their pollution. Here, the paradox tightens like a garrote. The very law that prevents a master from casually killing his slaves now demands the death of 400 innocents. The boundary that supposedly protects against arbitrary violence enables the greatest act of judicial mass murder in Roman domestic history. The crowd's pleas are ignored. The executions proceed. As the condemned are led through the streets, observers note something that Tacitus records with unusual emotion. The slaves do not rage. They do not curse their executioners. They walk in silence, some holding hands, others whispering prayers to gods, both Roman and foreign. They understand, perhaps better than their masters, the terrible machinery of the system they are trapped within. They know that Roman law sees them not as people but as examples, as objects whose destruction serves to reinforce a social order built on terror and compliance. Yet even in this horror, the boundary remains. The executions are conducted according to law, with the Senate's authorization, framed as necessary punishment rather than capricious murder. The masters of Rome have not violated the prohibition. They have followed the ritual script, transformed mass killing into legal procedure, and thus avoided the pollution they fear. The gods, they believe, will not turn away. The Pax Deorum holds. This distinction, invisible to modern eyes, was everything to Romans. A master who killed a slave in a drunken rage might face social censure but no legal penalty, provided he claimed it was discipline. But a master who methodically, deliberately murdered a slave without cause or ritual justification risked far more. He risked being seen as impious, ungodly, a man who disrupted the cosmic order. In the most extreme cases, he could face exile or even execution himself, not for murdering a slave but for endangering Rome through his impiety. The archaeological record hints at this tension. In the necropolis outside Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered the grave of a slave child, no more than 8 years old, buried with a small bronze amulet depicting Hercules. The burial suggests care, perhaps even affection, from the household that owned her. but her bones also show signs of severe malnutrition and a healed fracture that set improperly. She was valued enough to bury properly, yet not enough to feed adequately or treat her injuries. She existed in that liminal space where Roman sentiment and Roman law collided, where a master might weep at her funeral, yet never have questioned the conditions that led to her early death. Another inscription, found in the columbarium of the household of Livia, wife of Augustus, lists the names of slaves who died in service. Among them, a notation, Antiochus, who served faithfully and died by his own hand. Suicide among slaves was not uncommon, a final assertion of agency in lives stripped of autonomy. But the phrasing, by his own hand, carries weight. It absolves the household of responsibility. Antiochus's death is not pollution because it is self-inflicted. The boundary holds even in death. The consequences of violating this boundary could be catastrophic on a personal level. Vedius Pollio, a wealthy equestrian under Augustus, learned this when he attempted to punish a slave by throwing him into a pool of lamprey eels to be eaten alive. The offense was minor, a broken crystal cup. But Pollio's method was so grotesque, so transparently sadistic, that even Augustus, hardly a humanitarian, intervened. He demanded the slave be freed and ordered all of Pollio's expensive crystal cups smashed in front of him. Pollio's reputation never recovered. He became a symbol of the tyrant whose cruelty exceeded even Roman tolerance, a man whose impiety threatened the social fabric. This was the true boundary. Not killing itself, Romans killed constantly, in wars, in gladiatorial games, in judicial executions. But killing that served no recognized purpose, that was done for pleasure or on a whim, that disrupted the careful fictions Romans constructed to justify their violence. This was intolerable. It revealed the master as a beast, no better than the slaves he owned, and in a society that defined citizenship through self-control and dignitas, such a revelation was a kind of social death. The psychological architecture of this system was sophisticated and deeply cruel. Slaves internalized the boundary. They understood that while their masters could beat them, rape them, work them to death, there remained certain rituals, certain forms that constrained absolute power. A slave who appealed to a sacred altar, invoking asylum, had to be heard. A slave who was promised manumission in a master's will could not be casually killed to prevent the inheritance from shrinking. These were not protections born of compassion, but threads in a complex web of religious law, property rights, and social custom that sometimes, almost accidentally, preserved life. In the final analysis, what Romans couldn't do to their slaves reveals more about Roman anxieties than about any genuine limits on their cruelty. They could not kill without consequence, but the consequences they feared were not legal or moral, they were spiritual and social. They worried about divine anger, about the stain of pollution, about being seen by their peers as men lacking the self-discipline that separated Romans from barbarians. The slaves themselves, their suffering and humanity, remained invisible in this calculus. When Pedanius's 400 slaves were executed, Rome moved on. The Senate passed no new laws limiting the power of masters. No monuments were raised to the dead. Their names, if they were ever recorded, have been lost to time. What survived was the legal precedent, the reaffirmation that the collective punishment of slaves was not just permissible but necessary. The boundary had been tested and reaffirmed. The system held. In the ruins of Pompeii, in a small room off the kitchen of a wealthy home, archaeologists found graffiti scratched into the wall. The words are in crude Latin, the spelling erratic. I have been here, and I will not be forgotten. No name, no date. Just the desperate assertion of existence from someone who had been rendered legally non-existent. It is the most human artifact in all of Pompeii's frozen tragedy, a voice reaching across 2 millennia, insisting on memory. That unnamed slave could not be casually murdered without consequence, but the consequences were never about protecting their life. They were about maintaining an illusion, a collective fiction that allowed Romans to wield nearly unlimited power while believing themselves just, pious, and civilized. The boundary was real, but it was also a lie, a thin membrane stretched over a chasm of brutality, quivering but never quite tearing, maintaining the terrible equilibrium of a society built on the systematic dehumanization of millions. And perhaps what haunts most is this: they knew. The masters knew the boundary was arbitrary, a product of superstition and social convention, rather than genuine morality. The slaves knew the boundary offered no real safety, only the faintest, most unreliable protection. Yet both participated in maintaining it, masters because it allowed them to preserve their self-image, slaves because even the most fragile thread of restraint was better than none at all. In that complicity, in that shared maintenance of a fiction neither side truly believed, lies the most disturbing truth about power. It endures not through force alone, but through the willingness of both oppressor and oppressed to pretend it is something other than what it is. The slave in the villa that day, the one who flinched as the master's hand trembled, walked away. Not because he was spared by mercy, but because the master feared the gods more than he desired violence. It was not freedom. It was not even safety. It was simply another day in a system where the boundary between life and death was determined not by justice or humanity, but by the invisible calculus of pollution and piety, honor and fear. And in that trembling hand, suspended forever between striking and withdrawing, we see the entire architecture of Roman slavery, brutal beyond measure, yet constrained by forces its practitioners could not fully control or even understand, a monument to humanity's capacity for both systematic cruelty and the desperate, often futile construction of limits we hope will save us from ourselves.